Welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. We're extremely excited to have Calgary-based artist Marigold Santos share the trajectory of her practice with us in conversation with Haema Sivanesan. This conversation is presented in conjunction with the exhibition Human Capital that is on view until April 16th. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our partners, the Mackenzie Art Gallery, TACFAM, curator of the exhibition Human Capital. We acknowledge the support of the province of Alberta through Alberta Foundation for the Arts. We also gratefully acknowledge the ongoing support of the Canada Council for the Arts and Calgary Arts Development. Human Capital presents work that offers insight into the impact of Canada's immigration policies and history, how it treats humans as capital, and the role it plays in shaping the complex and contested formation of a Canadian identity. With that, I'd like to introduce our two amazing speakers tonight. Marigold Santos pursues the interdisciplinary art practice involving drawn, painted, printed works, sculpture, tattooing, and sound. Her work explores selfhood and identity that embraces multiplicity, fragmentation, and empowerment as informed by diasporic experiences. She holds a BFA from the University of Calgary and an MFA from Concordia University. As a recipient of grants from the Canada Council for the Arts, the Alberta Foundation for the Arts, and the Council of Arts and Letters, Quebec. Pardon my French, I do not know French, so I will not pronounce it in French. She continues to exhibit widely across Canada. Marigold Santos lives and works in Mohawkinstsis, Calgary. Welcome, Marigold. Haema Sivanesan is a curator, researcher, and art writer with extensive experience across a range of sectors in the visual arts in Canada and abroad. She has held leadership and curatorial positions in public art galleries, artist-run centers, and festivals in Canada and abroad. Her research typically focuses on Asian and Asian diasporic, transnational, and transcultural art histories. In 2018, she was the recipient of an Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, New York, Curatorial Research Fellowship, and in 2016, the recipient of Robert H.N. Ho Family Foundation, Hong Kong, multi-year research and exhibition development grant for the project In the Present Moment, Buddhism, Contemporary Art, and Social Practice. She is the newly appointed director, Leighton Studios, and program partnerships at the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity. Welcome you. And with that, I will invite both our speakers onto the platform, enjoy our presentation, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the conversation.
Hello. Wow. Marigold, I'm so excited to be here with you this evening.
Me too, Haema. Thank you, everyone who's here. I saw some familiar faces at the door, so thank you so much for being here tonight, everybody.
And thank you so much to Kanika and everyone at Contemporary Calgary for inviting us to do this.
Thank you.
Kanika has just introduced us with our professional bios, but I'm wondering, since we're here to talk about your work in the context of the Human Capital exhibition, would you like to introduce yourself in terms of your cultural background and your experience of immigration?
Yeah, thanks, Haema. So my family immigrated to Canada in 1988. I was 7 years old. And I was born in the Philippines, so that's where my cultural heritage is in. That's where my family's from. I was born in Manila, and I have a brother and sister who also immigrated to Canada at the same time as my mom and dad. And we first landed in Ontario, specifically in the town of Scarborough, and we stayed there for quite a bit until we moved to Alberta, I think when I was in grade 6.
Wow, so it's quite a journey, isn't it? Leaving a place, arriving in a new place, and all of that cultural, I don't know, it's sort of like a process of cultural translation that you go through as you move and try and figure out your place within a new country. I want to start talking about your work. You've got an amazing slideshow that you've prepared for us. But I wanted to start with the painting that's in the exhibition. It's called Regrounded. And it's one of your earliest paintings. And it's one of your earliest representations of the aswang. And I kind of want to get talking about that because it's such an important theme in your work, and it begins to pick up on some of the thematics of your personal experience that becomes translated into an artistic sort of theme, and it's been a recurring theme for a number of years. Could you first of all explain what the aswang is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I'm going to start with slides. Where do I direct
Right up
this?
here.
Like this?
Just advance.
Like this?
I can move it forward, I think.
Like this? Pause on a map. Oh, this is like my ASMR. Well, wow, okay.
Just say next slide when you want the next one.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Thank you for that. So I no longer need the clicker?
Nope.
Oh, bye. Okay, so we're going to start with this slide. I'm starting with this slide because it's probably my most close to like representational depictions of what aswang can be known to be in the Philippine culture. So for those who aren't already familiar with this figure that I use extensively in my practice, the aswang is this folkloric character in Philippine mythology. And it is a hybrid of like a witch and a vampire. So it's usually depicted as a female. There's various iterations of what this aswang can look like. So depending on the place it's being told, like the story is being told, and like who's telling the story, the aswang can really morph. But in essence, the one kind of aswang, so again, like aswang can sort of be a blanket statement for like a monstrous creature. And this figure is quite monstrous. Like I said, it's like a hybrid of a witch and a vampire and a ghoul. And the manananggal, specifically, one of the aswang characters, has the ability to self-sever. So it severs itself in half from like the waist up, and it leaves its lower half somewhere, and it kind of like, the upper half sort of flies around in the night, and then it has to, and does quite evil things, like eats people and babies and stuff, so it's scary. And then it has to rejoin its lower half by the end of the night or it dies. Fragmented, so like in essence part of its survival is this whole like self-segmenting, dividing thing, and then reattaching itself. And so there's a lot of stories around aswang. In the Philippines, it's kind of known as like a boogeyman type creature. There's so many different like stories around like how you would protect yourself from an aswang. Lots of like anecdotal things like wrapping your thumbs so that it doesn't bite you. There's lots of things about the aswang. Its hair can be really weaponized. Like I said, it's usually like a female figure. And then by day, it looks like a regular person. By night, it looks like an Aswang. And so when I was really interested in this Aswang character, not necessarily for like the gore or like the violence associated around it, but what I was really interested in was the fact that it had this inherent multiple self, and that itself, that its multiplicity was part of its survival. And so I really wanted to reconfigure the Aswang in my work. Like I wanted it to become some kind of symbol that I was going to use to talk about the things that were important to me, and talking about diaspora, talking about heritage, ancestry, and using the Aswang as a way to, as like a figure that I could like explore those things through. And this particular slide, like I said, is probably the most closely like related to the ways that it can be represented, even though this is very much not. And I was playing, these are prints, which are one of the few prints I ever made, even though I am a print media master student. So I was playing with this idea of like, okay, well, what if an Aswang divided itself in half and then couldn't find its other half? And what if it was like flying the night, and then it was like, oh, here's another half. I'm just gonna join here, and oh, it's not really my bottoms, but that's fine. And so I was kind of like playing around with these like kind of, you know, like just having fun with it. And the other one was also about like another anecdotal thing where it's like, if you don't know you're looking at an Aswang, you should put your head between your legs and look at it upside down, and then it will reveal its true self. And so then I was like, well, what if this Aswang was looking at another Aswang? And so this is kind of like where it started, or I was like quite playful with how I was thinking about it. And then it started to change over time, the way that it meant, what it meant for me, and how important it was as I kept doing my research on the Aswang. And I realized it wasn't just this like anecdotal thing, it wasn't just this boogeyman, that it really had a super deep, rich history and comes from colonial violence.
Was the Aswang a character that was always part of your growing up? Like, the story, how did you first come across the stories? And is the Aswang always represented as a female figure, or is that your own interpretation?
Yeah, like, so I credit all of the scary stories that I was told to my one Tita, which is my aunt. She's like my mother's sister, Tita Russell, props to you. She basically infiltrated my mind with all of these like scary stories. And you know, I was thinking about it, like in the Philippines, a lot of the folklore is quite scary, and I was really drawn to that. Like I didn't shy away from it, I liked being scared, and I still do, I think. It's changed now that I'm a mom, but so yeah, like that, all of this sort of folklore really informed like what I was interested in. And coming to Canada, and starting to make work about like diaspora and like this idea of selfhood and fragmentation, I really thought about, well, like what did I bring with me? Like, as you know, I was a little kid when I came here, and I certainly like didn't choose the materials that we brought. But what I did bring was like the stories, like the childhood narratives that was like embedded in my mind from the Philippines. And then the other question you had was,
is the Aswang always a female
yes.
figure?
Yeah, so no, the Aswang is not always a female, but the Aswang is like a shapeshifter. So that's also part of its like inherent multiple self. It can be, it can appear as like a bird, or a pig, or like a dog. So it sort of like changes itself. And also like depending on the region that's telling the story, it can appear predominantly as one thing over another.
Shall we move to the next slide,
Yes.
which I think is
Next slide, please.
the exhibition, the painting in the exhibition. And I'm going to get you to talk about this one in relation to the theme of the Aswang.
Yeah, so then like over time, the way that I thought about the Aswang self-segmenting didn't just become limited to herself segmenting just with her own body parts and then attaching back to body parts. It really became more organic, and I thought, well, like what if what the Aswang was like segmenting from and attaching was like her environment. And I will refer to the aswang as like her or it or they sometimes. So I use them all interchangeably when I speak about the aswang. And so I started a series where, so this is a painting, this is the one downstairs, and it's actually part of a series of 4 paintings, and they're all the same size, and they all feature this figure that's reclining, sometimes in different positions of height and sort of what's happening, but the gesture remains the same, and that figure is like a larger than life aswang that has severed points to it. And so you'll see, next slide please. This is just a detail of the head part. So this particular painting is called Regrounding, and in this one the aswang has fallen down into the lower half of the frame and is sort of like disintegrating or is in the process of transformation in some sort of earth area. But it's quite an otherworldly place that it's in. There's really kind of no time or true specificity to it. And next slide, please. You can see the areas where it's severed has some metallic leafing on it. So what I really want to call and highlight is the areas in where it's dividing. So there's lots of details. You can see that like there's sort of some botanical elements that's kind of like subsuming the figure. Next slide, please. And this is the detail of the feet of this figure. And actually, a good friend of mine who's here today had mentioned when she was coming down into the auditorium, like, oh, I saw this piece when you first presented this. Was like 10 years ago when I made this piece, and she had saw it in its original form, and she said, is this the one that you could put the black light on? Which is actually true, and I kind of forget to tell people that, but the figure, the aswang figure, has like phosphorescent paint underneath it, so if you were to turn off the lights, it would glow in a specific way. And wow. Yeah, I forget about that also myself, so thank you, Caitlin, for mentioning that.
And this is one of a series of 4 paintings, right? So I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about that, because I'm really fascinated by, on one hand, the scale at which you're working in these paintings and the attention to detail, because it's almost like you're drawing and painting at the same time, like the mark making is so intricate.
Yeah, and for me, like drawing and painting are interchangeable for sure. You know, it's kind of like a weird delineation to have between them. But, you know, for instance, like this painting has like watercolor, it's made with watercolor, and it's made with, you know, some things that were in my studio at the time, so whether or not that's like painting or drawing, there's also some paint in there, but yeah, so that's sort of interchangeable. Next slide, please. Here is, yeah, so here's like a
beautiful
image. This is a process image of, this was at my studio in Montreal, and you can kind of gather that it's really like a big painting, and it's like quite like a physical undertaking to paint at that scale, mainly because you are like in, you know, like I was always on a high ladder when I was painting this. This is one of the 4, and they're all, like I said, they're all the same size, so they all like asked of me to work on a ladder the whole time. What's another thing I can say about this? Yeah, so this piece is probably the newest out of the 4. This was done in 2017. It was for the Alberta Biennial. This one's called Sublimation, and it's hanging at the Raimi Modern in Saskatoon at the moment. And basically,
did you conceive of them as a series of 4? Like when you began making this body of work, did you had you kind of thought that through?
I didn't. Like, and I'll go, as I continue, you'll see the other 2 that are in the series. And those 2 really started it, but when I made the 2, I didn't really think it was going to go beyond that. So next slide, please. here's just a detail of like the head of that figure. And you can see that the figure repeats from like the gold one to this one. So it's enshrouded by these like woven garments. Next. And you can see that like the severing is in the same areas as well. And this time around it's treated with like kind of this like meltiness. And then in the figure's body, there's like celestial bodies and nebula and galaxies. Next. And also you start to see some of these botanical elements pop up in this one as well.
So were you thinking of relationships between like the body and the land, the body and space, the body and kind of like these as a metaphor?
For sure.
That was coming through?
Because like this one was the last one that I made, so I was really like taking into account all the three previous ones that came before this, and I really wanted this one to be this like really otherworldly, out of this universe kind of figure. And so, you know, encasing these like galaxies, these like universes within, really kind of like hyper scales this figure even more so.
And I think one of the things to point out for everybody here is that as a printmaker, these were like your first paintings. So
Yeah.
I find it extraordinary, the kind of confidence with which you went for it.
Yeah, actually, if you keep going, next slide. Oh, just I think this might be the last one for sublimation, so you can see a little bit more of that botanic elements, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the next slides. And this is the feet. So again, just like some close-ups. And here is like the presentation of this at the AGA for the biennial. And they were surrounded by like hundreds of these little gold hand-formed sculptures that I had made. They were like everywhere from like little teeth to finger bones to like nonsensical golden bits. So this was, this is how it was presented. Next slide. So this is maybe like a good slide to talk about what Haema just mentioned, because when I told Haema about this painting that I made in, I want to say 2011, I was still in my master's, so this was like my thesis work. And it was, you know, I had no concept of what painting, like how to make paintings, because I didn't take any painting classes. Like I didn't take any in my undergrad, and I certainly didn't in my master's. So but it was sort of like this, I just wanted to make images on like a bigger surface, and I couldn't find paper that was big enough. So I bugged some of my painter friends, and I was like, can I use canvas? And they're like, yes. And I was like, okay, well, where do I get that? And I'm like, what do you do? And they're like, well, you put this stuff called gesso on it. And I was like, okay. So I really had to like teach myself. It sounds so silly, but like that's really what I had to do.
And you're just working on flat canvas, right? It's not stretched, or is it stretched?
Well, what I did was and this is how I work all the time, is I stretch it directly onto a wall. And then I get it like nice and tight. And then I like gesso and do whatever from there, and then I stretch it after that. But this one, I presented it like a tapestry or like a free-floating drawing, because that's sort of like how I always thought it was. And so you can see the edges here are not stretched like the one downstairs. And this is like, you know, made out of charcoal and highlighters and like watercolor and whatever I kind of had. And so and this piece was probably also one of the first pieces I ever sold. And I'll tell you where it's hanging. It's hanging in the Aldo headquarters. I mean, I like couldn't believe that they wanted it. I was like, okay.
Ghoulish painting that's hanging in a corporate office.
Yeah. And it was like hanging in the international like office. Like if it's still there, they have like an art collection. Like Aldo has like an official, beautiful art collection. So maybe they rotate it. Like I don't know if it's still hanging in the same office as where it was installed, but I like remember seeing like the workers in that office like watching the install, being like, okay. And then I was like, just so you know, this one also glows in the dark. Just for your own.
So when you leave the office at night and turn off the lights,
anyway,
it comes to life in a different way.
Yeah. Oh,
Is there a next image, or
I think
wanna
we can,
keep
oh yeah,
going?
next, sorry. Next slide. Yeah, so here, this, you can see, oh, yeah, you can see some of the details happening. So in this is the first painting that started the series of this like levitating figure. And the first two are called Light as a Feather, Stiff as a Board, which is like this childhood game that you play, which I discovered when I moved to Canada. And I was like, what is this magic? I love it. And so I was really enthralled at this idea of like, you know, kind of the supernatural at your fingertips. So these were like one of the first ways that I was like envisioning the aswang, and they're sort of playing that game with this figure. Each aswang is made out of its own elements. You can see there's like woven, some like fungi. Next slide. This is like a detail of the feet, and you can kind of see like the charcoaly bits too.
Pay a lot of attention to the feet, right?
Mm-hmm. And hands, definitely. Yeah.
Yes, and the hands.
Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in like another
As we
slide.
go along, yeah.
Next slide. This is a butt, a mushroom butt. Next slide. And so this is the last of the pieces. So this one was made in conjunction with that very first one that we saw, with the like stormy element. So that's Light as a Feather, Stiff as a Board 1, and this one is Light as a Feather, Stiff as a Board 2. And so they were like just the diptych that I initially dreamed up. Yeah, and so this is like in a big color field of pink. It's suspended in, whereas the first one was like really more physical. It's happening in a space that seems like it has gravity and time. This one is happening in like a psychological space. And so color fields started to become this like psychological space that some things were happening on, and this figure is like literally stiff as a board now. So you can see that where the figures were standing, they're removed, and that's where the figure is severed.
And you're seeing these shards of like crystal, I guess, coming out of the feet.
Mm-hmm, the
So
feet.
it has a different.
Mm-hmm. And then that foot is like gold as well. And it's like sort of the figures made out of different elements of wood, like plywood and birch, some things that are woven. Yeah, lots of different elements here. And you can skip to the next slide. So here's just like a little detail of so what you can see is that really the figure repeats in all four. Next slide. Like that. And last slide. Oh, yeah, we can stay at this one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is perfect because I want to ask you about, again, coming back to the aswang. You've talked about how the aswang is a way for you to research your culture. And so it's a kind of way for you to find yourself in your Filipino culture as much as you're kind of creating it as you go along. And it seems like these images, to me at least, express that in such a beautiful way. The aswang has taken on a different kind of characteristic, and it's now moving and dancing, and there's a sort of spaciousness to it. And you start to bring in these very specific references to the Philippines, I think, and these sort of floral motifs and different motifs that you introduce. Do you want to talk a little bit about this set of images?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for me, like over time, as I was like evolving the ways that I was thinking about the aswang, like given, you know, the work that I was making over the years and like what my research was going into, it really started to become like a stronger presence where I really wanted to claim that this was the way I was exploring diaspora. And like more recently too, so this painting is probably from a couple years ago. I wanted to start bridging some elements of my work that were up until this point really separate. So you know, like making a slideshow like this, it's like, you know, 50 slides of just a select handful of pieces, but my practice is like quite diverse. And one of the things that I make are landscape paintings. Like they're just landscapes that are surreal and they're void of like figures. And in lieu of the figure, there are like formations and there's, you know, flora that are like anthropomorphized, and they're sort of enacting the figure. And then prior to these paintings, I was also making a lot of like the aswang figures separate, like in like ink drawings, with this kind of mark making. So like the ink the aswang sort of became less about being didactically divided in half, and more so this figure becoming this unraveling or like figure in flux. So it was like in transition of something. It was in between states. And so I merged them together in these series of paintings that I really want to talk about this idea of a fragmented selfhood. And that's sort of at the core of like what my practice is really about. And it was sort of introduced by Kanika, that, yeah, my work is really dealing with this idea of selfhood and multiplicity and empowerment through this like experience and through this way of acknowledging like who you are in this society and how you present, and embracing sort of those things that come to you fragmented, and the parts of you that are fragmented, and then through that transformation is possible. So all that said, like all of these paintings with these figures of aswang, they look otherworldly, they look surreal, but they have elements that are, you know, taken from my cultural history and my experiences, and then I abstract them. So that's another like really key term that I use in my work, is this idea of abstraction, so that you're not quite sure what these are. Like, I mean, if you were to like take maybe one of my aunts from the Philippines and like put her here and be like, this is an aswang, she would be like, how? I don't understand. And so it's a very abstracted way that I talk about this figure. It's not just illustrating the figure.
And it's become very personalized too, right? You've kind of taken on the persona and interpreted it for your own purposes.
Totally, to talk about, you know, not just anymore about like this sort of violence that she comes from, and also the violence that she enacts, and that she's kind of void of violence, and she's instead all about like self-determination and strength and resilience and empowerment. So that's sort of like kind of the themes that's in there. And then, so like for instance, in this piece, she's wearing like a very big hat. And so that is like an abstraction of this traditional hat. In the Philippines, called a salakot. And it would be like a woven hat, like very commonplace object that you would see. You sort of wear it if you're like in the fields. It protects you from the elements. And so these kinds of objects become like elevated in my practice. They become these like iconic little symbols that are present, that are quite meaningful, and that I call upon when I'm thinking about being tethered to my culture as a person in diaspora, which is like these things come to me in very fragmented ways, like little snippets. Next slide.
So this is all part of a series, is that right? Or how did you conceive of this body of work?
I wouldn't say that they were, these were not presented together, but they were conceived of in the same time frame. So this is sort of like what was in my mind at the time. And so I was making these like woven figures that like look like ink unraveling, and they would have some kind of botanical element. This one has tamarind, and for those who like know Philippine cuisine, there's this like, you know, tamarind is a really big part of our cuisine. It's a very sour fruit. It's an integral part of like a dish called sinigang, and you know, when you're thinking about your culture and you're tethering to it, you're really calling upon your sensorial memories. So, you know, taste and smell, touch and like patterns and textures, all those things contribute to how you relate to a culture that's kind of intangible to you, you know?
So you're saying that this symbolism that you're drawing on, the flowers, the fruit, maybe even the textile and basketry references, it's almost more synesthetic, like you're calling on smell, taste, touch, those kinds of things.
Totally.
Aesthetic memory rather than symbolism necessarily.
Right, for sure. And what I really appreciate is that like folks that are, you know, of diasporic backgrounds, they see that, and whether they're from the Philippines or not, they can see these like botanical elements. They can see like the fruit, and they know, and they've got their own stories too. Like, I mean, same with the Aswang. They're like, oh yeah, in my culture we have something that's very similar. So there is sort of something that happens collectively among people. And so for me, when I started really embedding these really obvious markers, that really starts happening more like in the tattoo practice. But here you can see, like when I put like tamarind there, I know that certain folks see that and go, oh, I know that, and so here's like this kind of creepy figure dancing with these like tamarind pods, and it's shroud, which is another term that I call the Aswang figure. Over time, I just call them shrouds, or shroud Aswang. So this one is kind of like this weird, lacy, mushroomy type figure, and you can see that they're transparent.
Did that iconography just kind of evolve for you, or you're not drawing from anything else necessarily?
No, it's a really good question, and it did evolve, because like in the beginning you saw like the first Aswang just like long hair, so the long hair was like, really literal, like my most literal depiction of an Aswang. And then from there, it's sort of, actually the next, in like a few slides forward, you'll see that when I started making ink drawings, the Aswang shroud became, like the hair became garments, like woven garments, but also these like transparent, inky, blotty kind of like second skin. And then it morphed into like other things like this, and then also other, like the hats. So if anything, they're all just become, oh yeah, next slide. So again, this is like an abstracted salakot with like one of these Aswang figures. Its body is like of this textural nature where it looks quite layered. And you'll see a lot of that in my upcoming work.
And I love how you contrast these really ghoulish figures with this really beautiful aesthetic sort of details, the fruit, or, like that sort of contrast of scary and beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, like they become like, to me, they become less scary because they're just like my friends or like versions of me. But like, but they are scary, they're weird, and I mean, I just love the weird.
And they're hidden and mysterious and dark.
Totally. And so this one's like holding fruit, or surrounded by fruit that like, I grew up eating. There's calamansi seed and like, star fruit, which there was like a tree in my cousin's like balcony, and like, anyway, so it's all of these sensorial memories that are now like I'm sort of calling upon. Next slide. And this one here is covered with window pane shells, and shells around, and it's wearing this like abstracted version of a Filipiniana, which is like Filipina couture in the Philippines, called a terno. So the sleeves look very much like that, but they would be like, made out of fabric. But they're another term for them is like butterfly sleeves. And it's like a traditional wear, and it's got like very starchy pleated cleats, starch pleats. You wear them, they're like quite high shoulders, and like for a long time they were really associated with, like Marcos era fashion. And so, I know a lot of folks in diaspora are really reclaiming this symbol and sort of like subverting it from like its original way that, or not even original, but like how it's sort of viewed, and sort of like associating it from that problematic era and reclaiming it again as another symbol of a way to tap into their heritage, especially in the diaspora. Well, I mean,
so it almost looks very futuristic, this like big shoulder blades and the headpiece, which could almost be out of a sci-fi movie or something like that. It has this sort of very futuristic kind of feel to it.
Yeah, for sure. And like also with the figure having like this marked body. So again, you start to see this kind of texture, and that really calls into like the wood from the Philippines, marbling, sort of like this hard surfaces that I recall growing up around. I think, next slide. So yeah, this one is really, I guess like I was tying this one into.
It refers to the other painting
Mhm.
that's in the exhibition downstairs, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
We can talk about the two of them together, perhaps.
Yeah, so there is another painting downstairs, and there's a slide coming up for that. But this one I just wanted to place in there beforehand. As you can see, like I really love painting hands and feet. They are parts of the body that, for me in my physical experience, are like my touch points. So hands are like, you know, how I make my art. It's where I touch things, and they become like these counter places that then I can sort of absorb. And the feet specifically too are like where I can feel grounded and think about, you know, like symbolically that way. So hands and feet are really important. And so when I talk about sensorial memories, this one in particular talks about this. I mean, for people from the Philippines or like who know, there is a candy that's, well, some candies that you like bring back from the Philippines when you go visit, and then you come home and then you bring these things with you. You can find them there. But like, for instance, one thing called Haema, and they are always wrapped in these like yellow cellophane wrappers. And when my family and I would like go back to the Philippines and then come back to Canada, we would bring these treats with us, and it was kind of a way to like extend your vacation or your visit to your homeland, you know, by this extension of like tastes and textures and feelings. So I think like when I make my paintings, it's sort of that as well, you know, like this idea of trying to tap into something untappable and like extending what I do have.
So there's a way in which the body that you're painting is sort of embedded with all of this memory of another place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that like every time, you know, memories are interesting things. Like the more you think about something, the more that it can become fictionalized in your head too, right? So then you kind of can get creative as well. So the act of remembering is like the act of forgetting too. It's like a dream.
Do you want to talk about the next?
Yes, next slide, please. So yeah, this is the one downstairs. So this one is quite small compared to like the mammoth one. And this one shows like a hand that's quite fluid, and it's sort of melting, and around it are these pearls that are suspended. And so like when I was making this piece, I was thinking a lot about like my relationship to my hands, and like how my hands are like my touch points and all that stuff that I just talked about. And thinking a lot about like, you know, pearls and sort of where I saw them in my childhood. And so, you know, like in the Philippines, I grew up Roman Catholic. I'm no longer like a religious person, but most Filipinos are like sort of in that church when you're born there. And so like my grandparents were, and I would see like a lot of icons and a lot of like rosaries around, and for me they didn't really mean anything except for they were just textures. They were just like objects that I was surrounded by. And then now, because like I have such like a considered art practice, and I really think about the history of colonization, the history of like Christianization, the destruction. Like I think about all of these objects that I just thought were mundane, like rosaries and you know, like the saints that, and the floral garlands that my grandmother would put on them. And they just play a role now where I don't necessarily, I take them away from like their origins in my actual history and abstract them again. So that
So there's a transformation or a transfiguration or something that's going on, because even in the image of the hand, it's now like melted wax or something like that. Like it's not like skin and bone anymore.
Yeah, I mean, and like the fluidity in these kind of melty things is always just how I talk about transformation too, right? Just same with like the woven elements that you see in my work. It's a way for me to talk about a fragment itself, and that symbolically, whenever you see woven things in my work, it really just talks about this ability to come apart, and that anything that's woven or braided or kind of created in that form has the ability and potential to be repaired and come together again. Just like the aswang, right? And all the various possibilities that coming together and coming apart can present. And so sometimes when things are broken apart, they can be forged back in a stronger way. So really when you talk about diaspora and resilience, that's really an important thing that you carry around with you.
Maybe we can go to the next slide. This is a fabulous image. I love it. It was hanging in your studio, I think, when I came by. Do you want to talk a little bit about this? I love the way in which the aswang is looking back at you.
Yeah, so I sort of like put a bunch of these works on paper in the next few slides coming up, because I wanted to show also like in the paper way, like how the aswang was like evolving. And so this is like one of my very first depictions of like the big salakot hat, and my real like love affair with ink on a surface. And so I made these paintings. You can see that there's like this kind of, maybe not in this one so much, but the next one. But there's like a shape where they're kind of enshrouded in this like inky garment. Next.
And they're becoming more and more like these sort of syncretic figures, like this has multiple eyes and an abstracted body and the radishes.
Yeah, these like root vegetables that have been uprooted and displaced. And again, so like this one and the next one after. Next. You can see that like the figures are like enshrouded in this like second skin. And for me, like when I started to draw the aswang like this, I wanted it to read less of a garment, but more of like this other skin that was like interchangeable with the body, and that the blotches were to represent blood or bruises or staining, so that each individual ink stain was a way to talk about experience, like an individual experience, because each ink stain on each aswang was like not repeatable.
And it's almost like there's a theme of twinning that comes up in your work as well, like these twinned figures.
Yeah, like I would say not so much twinning, but more like just multiple, so that it doesn't necessarily have to be like just one or two, that it could be like multiple and you're not sure if that's the same figure or not. So for instance, the next one is again another one that like Haema's maybe also talking about twinning. And this is a aswang on the shoulders of another. So again, talking about like this sense of, just like maybe carrying a particular weight. But why I brought these up, or why I put them in the slideshow, is to illustrate like this relationship I have with ink, which comes up a little bit later in my practice. So next, and here is another. And I also placed these slides because these drawings are quite old and I never really get to see them, and I saw these slides in my...
Very beautiful, because you have a very light hand, but very elegant and very precise. So I've really enjoyed looking at them too.
Thanks, Haema. I really love that ink is something that you can't really control, like when you work with it on paper, and there's like a sense of permanence, which comes really into play with my tattoo practice. You know, that's permanent ink right there. Next slide. And I think this might be the last one in this series. So again, like you can see that when I started to evolve the aswang into this kind of pattern, which comes from like patterns in the Philippines, like this particular mat that you see in your daily life called a banig has this pattern. It happened more with ink on paper before it happened like with paint and brush. And like the ink and paper really allows me to be like really immediate and direct with my ideas.
Did these come before the very large paintings, or?
Yeah, they came before the paintings that had the landscape on them, but this one certainly did not come before like the big ones downstairs.
At the beginning.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Next. And so yeah, this slide here will lead into like the tattoo work. So
Oh, sorry.
go back, please. I just wanted to quickly say that, like, at this moment when I was drawing these, like, the shroud now, like, evolves into, like, these, like, mythical serpents. So again, the shroud is, like, constantly changing. The aswang's, like, figure and, like, how I present the aswang is just constantly evolving depending on, like, what I'm thinking about the time. And the body of this aswang is now, like, marked with these, like, ink blots more evidently than before. And kind of coincided with the same time that I started tattooing as part of my practice. So you can go into the next slide.
So the aswang figure looks kind of bruised, but then the tentacles have like a floral design or something, a bit more deliberate or intentional, seems like.
Yeah, like I just really wanted to play with textures for that one. Like with these serpents that I was making, I would put like, yeah, like floral part. The floral was also really like calculated, you know, I would like use botanical stuff from like my heritage and things that were like important for me to see. Surrounding these like snakes that have become like really symbolic in my work as well, as like a way to talk about like outgrowing yourself and like shedding and sort of, yeah, basically just outgrowing yourself.
So you're best known around the country, I guess, as a painter, but your practice is so very versatile. And I know we're going to segue into talking about your tattoo work. Can you, as you're talking about some of these images, can you talk a little bit about how you've acquired your skills? Because you're self-taught in so many of these areas in which you work. And I've found that really fascinating as well, and the way you've kind of gone about acquiring those skills. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so with tattooing, as is like other things that I'm not like trained in, it was something that I wanted to do that I didn't realize I wanted to. Like I've only started tattooing maybe like 5 years ago. And I was always like getting tattooed when I was younger, you know, when I was like allowed to legally. And then I didn't really think that I was going to be ever in the position where I wanted to give tattoos. But over time, I had a lot of friends that were like encouraging me to do it. And I was like, man, I don't really want that pressure. But what I found is in my art practice, I would have like these exhibitions and I have like my paintings, and I realized that like the people who were coming to my shows and supporting me and being there for my openings weren't necessarily the ones who were going to be buying my paintings. And so I wanted to make my work accessible to them as well, and to give them a chance to have access to my work that was different. And so tattooing really came out of that, was like providing something that was like maybe more economical, or like had a different experience that they wanted to maybe like engage with my work in that way. And so when that came about, I was, you know, I didn't really want to go through the conventional routes of like being an apprentice to somebody and like having that person really control like my education in this particular thing. So again, I took it upon myself to just find folks who were okay with knowledge exchange and workshopping, and that's how I learned how to tattoo, was through these really generous individuals that were willing to exchange knowledge for other things. Yeah.
And you've talked about that as a decolonial way of learning as well, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, because like, you know, in the beginning when I was just getting tattooed at like 18, you know, there wasn't a lot of choices out there. Like basically there were like tattoo shops, and they were mainly run by men, and they were white men. And that sort of industry really, I didn't see any representation of anyone that was, you know, BIPOC, and very few women. So there wasn't a lot of choice. And so when I wanted to ask for knowledge exchange and workshopping, I found that the most generous individuals for me were, you know, queer, femme-identifying individuals who have felt some form of oppression or marginalization that were like the most generous. And so that was like a very easy way to feel cared for by each other. And so what I wanted was to create a practice, a tattoo practice for myself that really emulated that idea. Something that was like decolonized, something that was like an anti-oppression, liberated focus practice where, you know, I'm sort of disavowing the problematic parts of like the tattoo industry and claiming something that is more of like a lateral hierarchy in that space, things that are really different, making your client feel very comfortable and a reciprocal environment more than feeling, like they're a power dynamic.
Do you want to talk about some of these images?
Yeah,
so click through some of the tattoo images.
Yeah, there isn't any blood, so I didn't like give any trigger warnings for these. There isn't any like skin penetration, but here are just some slides of the tattoos that I started working out. So obviously this is like a swan figure. You know, this
it's
one
a really stunning tattoo actually, and I think part of why I really responded to this image had to do with how the painted image now becomes a lived and living image when it's carried on the body in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. Like tattooing brought like a whole other world to my practice. You know, it allowed community to come in, and it was like really like a community finding act for me as well, and like a community asserting act. You know, like people always ask me like why I started tattooing, and I always say like it was for access for people, but it was also a way for me to acknowledge that like inking skin is part of my cultural heritage. Pre-colonially, right? So it's somehow in our ancestry, and I have a right to do it, and I'm gonna do it. And so that, and I also just wanted to create a space that was, or a part of my practice that was gonna be very ethical, given like the messaging behind the work. So next slide. Yeah, so this is just like another image of that same swan divining. And this is a nice little collage of some recent ones that I've done on folks' bodies of color that are really important to me. That, you know, it's important for me to make these works and find community through my tattooing. So, you know, like growing up, I didn't have like a huge Filipino community around me. And I was talking about that with somebody recently who I was tattooing. And he was like, I think it's because you didn't go to Catholic school. Oh. And I was like, I think you're right. And so for a long time, you know, I just didn't have a lot of like Filipinos, Filipinas in my life. And then when over time, it wasn't just tattooing that brought this community to me, but it certainly helped in that. And so when I make Flash, I'll insert certain fragments in there from my paintings. Like you can see there's the tamarind there on Robbie. There's like on my bio, which are like fans that you'll see here on Gina. And you know, like these are, when people see them in the Flash, they immediately, and Flash are like pre-made designs that tattoo artists will release and make available for the public to claim. So people of Filipino origin will be like, oh my God, I want that. And it really like resonates with them. And to me, that brings me a lot of joy because that also brings the community to me.
So it's a very relational process, it's a community building process, and it involves a lot of trust, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Because like up until now, I'm talking all about how like my work is about selfhood and like self and all that self-talk. But really like the evolution of my practice is really talking about community. And so like how you can be an aware self and where you align with your community and how that becomes like a powerful collective.
Mm-hmm. I think your next slides then go on to look at your ceramic work.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk about that? Because again, you're self-taught.
Yeah.
Yeah.
True. So this is a kind of a good slide to follow up with because I've made some ceramics, and when I work with clay, I found it was like around the same time that I was learning to tattoo as well. And it was, you know, this surrogate body that I was able to mark, and I love the symbolism of like firing it and having it become stronger after it comes out of the fire. After like you give it some adversity, it comes out like rock hard. And so I love that. But I think the story maybe that Haema wants me to talk about is that when I learned to work with clay, and I'm by no means an expert, but how I learned was through trade again and through knowledge sharing. And there was a ceramicist in Montreal that I just happened to meet. I really loved her. She was a production potter, so she was making like the same objects, and I loved what she did, and I just approached her and I asked her, like, can I hire you to teach me some things? And in the beginning, you know, it was that I was like paying her, but then eventually I started to learn to tattoo, and then we just did it by trade. And she's like, I will teach you everything you want to know and give you access to my kiln, and you can just tattoo me. And I was like, done. So it was this really beautiful exchange between her and I like really hold her quite close to me because she really empowered me with a lot of knowledge.
And again, it's getting you to talk about all of these things because it's so much about community building, again, right, in the ways in which knowledge is shared, that cultural processes are shared in these ways, becomes a way of extending that, I don't know, the cultural learning, the community aspect of the work, and the way in which it circulates and acquires meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. Next slide. And this is just also happening in, this is in Marigold's studio, like in Montreal. And you can see that I learned how to hand build. So I was making these forms, and then I would fire them, bisque fire them, and then I would draw on them like I was drawing with ink, but with underglaze. So it was like this really beautiful way for me to learn how to use like brush on surface again in a different way. And yeah, this is the final slide. This is just like this series of just some ceramic works that I did. This was at the Dunlop Gallery. And you can see that I was sort of just making a whole bunch of different objects, like from wheel thrown to hand built pieces.
So maybe this is a segue to ask about what you're currently working on, and you have a new exhibition up at the art gallery, the Southern Alberta Art Gallery, actually. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because it's also taking your work into a new direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this final question is, like, I was wondering how I was gonna address this final question, and I guess like initially he might asked, well, I will ask you about what you're up to next, and what I'm working on. And so what I'm working on a lot is being a mom, and this slide is really talking a lot about that. So the direction of my work now is really dealing with the same things that I've already talked about, but with an added layer of parenthood in there, and all the things that go on with, you know, having this responsibility and having this huge change happen to your body, your mind, your lifestyle, and everything. And so this is a drawing with paint on paper, actually. And it's got this really beautiful texture. It's very flat, which is like what my paintings are.
It almost looks like a print.
Yeah.
Factor.
Yeah, it kind of looks like a silk screen. And it shows like these two figures, and to me they're like these mother figures, you know, their bodies have shown that they have endured some sort of process, and they're caring for fruit. And so this title of this piece is like Shroud Caring for Fruit, and the fruit that they're caring for is a way for me to talk about children, or loved ones. Doesn't necessarily have to be from the perspective of a mother. But the fruits are, you know, can be seen as like maybe jackfruit or durian. They're kind of interchangeable when I draw them. Fruits that are also common in the Philippines. But here, you know, I draw these figures with these like elongated nipples, which is like a really, like a common thing when you're, you know, like chest or breastfeeding, which was like an experience that I had. And that there's two of these Aswang characters that look almost identical, but you're not really sure. And so for me, it is also talking a lot about like community in terms of like child rearing and how you call on your community to help you with that. Because like, you know, when I was postpartum, it was like, if I didn't have the help of my community around me to like to feed me and to watch my child every now and then, you know, I wouldn't have a practice. I wouldn't be where I am, where I stand. So again, it's really important.
Do you want to just click through your last few slides? I can see kind of, I think we're needing to wrap up. Yeah. But,
yeah, we're at the end, and
yeah.
so this is actually, like, again, more of these slides that deal with this idea of parenthood and making invisible labor more visible, in addition to everything else that I've talked about. So this one here is a painting as well, and you can see that this figure's hands are in this like woven, braided thing, which really talks about all the other woven things I've talked about, but really her hands are more visible because I really want to show that.
And I think
touch
you have
my
a detail in the next slide, maybe?
Yeah, there you go.
And do you want to talk about some of the collaboration in this project?
Yeah, actually, so the next slide after this guy is, I think there's just two. This one here is, again, from that same series. The figure is kind of like showing you that she sees you and that you see her. And the next slide is this show that I have at the SAG right now. So this is the pace and rhythm of time floating, which translates as tulin at kumpas ng oras lumulutang in Tagalog. And so next slide, this is like the evolution of that smaller painting that I just showed. More of the same ideas of like dance. Oh, actually, I haven't talked about dance, but this one really involves dance. The show really centers around this folk dance in the Philippines called Dinikling, and how I abstract Dinikling to talk about ways of decolonizing and diaspora, and dancing as a way to dance in between spaces and experiences. So the next one is 4 paintings of these 4 dancers that are doing the Dinikling dance, which involves 2 pacemakers holding 2 bamboo sticks that they clap together, and the dancers dance in between the clapping sticks. And so that's sort of like the heart of the show, but the show itself has other elements brought into it. Next slide. Here's just some details of the 4. You can see that in each slide they have like different backgrounds, but there's like the sticks are sort of the running theme. And another image. These ones are quite big. They're 40 by 80 inches. And this is the last slide. And this is like a really important slide because you can see that there's writing on the wall. And the writing on the wall is my own personal writing. It's like this 4-panel poem that I made that talks a lot about like what I've been talking about already in the latter half. My ruminations around like parenthood, diaspora, responsibility, history, like there's so many things there. And then I have worked with somebody to translate it. Her name is Bianca Miranda, and she lives here in Calgary. She's a playwright, an incredible artist and writer, and we worked together on the translation of it in Tagalog. And I really wanted to see Tagalog on the walls, front and center, and highlighted, because that's something that you don't really see. And then also in the background of the show, there is a recording audio of me reading the Tagalog, which is kind of interesting for my mom because I don't speak Tagalog anymore, but I used to. When we moved to Canada, that was my first language, and then I've since lost it. So the act of reading it and practicing it and stumbling through it is really part of the art. So that is the show in Lethbridge. If you guys want to drive down there, you can. But if not, there'll be another time to see it.
Do we have a few minutes for questions, Kanika? How are we going? Yeah? Okay, shall we turn it over to the audience? And,
Okay.
yeah?
No pressure.
All right.
But if you have a question.
I feel like we should clap first.
Thank you. Thanks you guys for being so patient, being such a great listening audience. Thank you so much. I know I spoke a lot.
It's such a great overview of your work, though, and
Thanks.
such richness and depth to your practice. So, yeah. Are there any questions? There's one over there.
Yep. You can use one of ours.
There, now you can see people.
Okay.
So I will say that I grew up in Calgary today, and I saw your show and I've hung out with it a couple of times, and it made the drive beautiful because it's really exciting. So thank you for showing and sharing all of your history with us. My question had to do with the process of painting. It strikes me as a printmaking. You have to plan everything in advance. And with painting, you don't necessarily have to do that. And I'm wondering how much of your work is it like you know what you want to do and it's all sort of drawn out and you just sort of like do the steps, or is it sort of transform throughout and you're adding elements and thinking about what it is while you're making it? And just like hoping you can speak about your process yet.
Yeah, thank you for that question, and thank you for driving out here to see the talk. I really appreciate it. Okay, so because I have a printmaking background, and that was sort of like my foundation for like making work in a education setting, I really was influenced by printmaking. And so when I make paintings, somebody, I think it was Naomi Potter, said, your paintings are really unforgiving. And she's right, because when I make them, I work from the back forward. So I agonize over like the background first, like in all of the landscapes and like the figures. The background is like crucial. And I work forever on getting those gradients and whatever. And then I can't mess up ever, because then I work forward from there and there's like no going back. So there is a real sense of planning that I do have to do because I don't want to mess it up. Because even though I can make like whatever, a drip here, like change my mind on certain things, I can always pivot and do something with it. But when I have like a certain vision, I kind of really just carry it forward. So I work in layers, and that's where I learned that. I kind of learned that in printmaking, I would think, and all that pre-planning. Ironically, that's why I stopped printmaking, because I didn't really like the planning so much and all of the like editioning and all that. But I have a real soft spot for printmaking. The other part to your question is like, how do I like? Does it evolve over, or how much do I plan? And I would say that I plan about 50% of my painting. I have this like this habit of not drawing things out. Like I will make, for every painting I do, I will make a thumbnail sketch that is maybe 2 by 2 inches. And then in that thumbnail sketch, it's like little ticks. But from it, there's like notes that are like pumpkin color, sky, like da-da-da-da-da, like all these notes of how I want it to look, but it's not visually laid out yet. And then when I start painting, it may or may not follow that recipe. I might just respond to what I've already put down, and then it might just take a complete U-turn and do something differently, but I'm open to that as well. So I guess like, it's really dependent on if I like mess up that background or not. And it sounds so nerdy, but it's so true. Those backgrounds are like where it's at. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I have like 1.5 questions. One of them is the way that you do your hair, specifically in that purple one. It looks like you've taken a big brush and like run it down. but in other parts it looks like you've gone with a small one and just done all of the little tiny details. So how did you do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Those in that series, you'll see they're just like flowing brush marks, like from the background all the way to like how I do the body in the hair. And so I use two things. I use very big brushes that I make like very gestural marks with and loose marks, and then I go back and I use a super teeny tiny brush, and then I like embellish the brush marks. And so it's like a hybrid of like a truthful brush mark and then an invented brush mark.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks.
The other one is that I am also a multimedia artist, and I find it sometimes difficult, sometimes freeing to explain to people that I do a ton of different materials. But justifying that a little bit, would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a really simple answer to that, which is, and Haema already knows it, which is that I get really bored. And so she's laughing, because I told her that once and she laughed. But it's so true, like I just get very bored quite easily, and my boredom dictates where and when and what I do. So when I tire of one thing, then I sometimes want to like stimulate my brain and learn something new. And maybe that's why I take it on myself to learn, because it's quite exciting for me. But it also dictates when I'm finished a painting. So when I'm like, I get to the point where I'm kind of bored of it, I'm like, I think it's done. And then, and I trust that. I trust that instinct.
Thank you. I did also note in the context of that you have not got bored of the Aswang, and that's a really interesting tension, I think, for me when I look at your work, because there's a thematic thread all the way through that you have maintained a commitment to, but then within that you're exploring through various media and constantly giving her a new life, it seems like. So, yeah.
You're right, Haema. Thank you.
Hello. Oh no, this is so loud. Hello, hi. Firstly, hi. Hello. Hi. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for sharing so much of your art making process and your inspirations, cultural and not. That's really cool, and I appreciate it. My question comes from kind of more of like a thematic angle. What I love, like the fact that you use the Aswang in so many different ways, and something that stood out to me a lot is like the weighted multiplicity. And from my like interpretation of a lot of the pieces, it almost feels like you're meeting these Aswang. So much of like the myth is like spotting them or not being seen by them. So do you feel like that multiplicity extends in almost being the storyteller and the story listener of these Aswang when you're making these pieces?
Yeah, that's great. Yes, I do. Because I feel like the Aswang is, in essence, a way that I like explore myself. And as a person in diaspora, like I've had to be a multiple person, or not even consciously, but then when I think about myself, I realize like how multiple I have to be. And even like, you know, I was talking to somebody about this recently, and it's not necessarily a great thing, but like, you know, when you are a POC, there's a lot of code switching that you have to do. It's like inevitable in your life. And I never really understood how much labor that is to have to do that. Until, you know, recently, or until you have the language to, or the kind of maybe awareness that comes about through some kind of maturity or some kind of reflection. And so, yeah, I think like the multiplicity in me as a maker is embedded into these characters. And then what I will hope is that the viewers of this work can reflect on just like multiplicity as a thing that is part of us, like, and this idea of fragmentation is sort of part of, even if you're not from a diasporic background, it is just part of the evolution of selfhood as your experiences inform, you know, your life. So yeah, I hope that answers a bit of your question.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking. I think
think we can take one more question.
One more. Thank you guys for being so patient and nice.
My question is a little bit more specific in terms of like your tattooing with your process. I've really enjoyed how you've kind of translated your fine arts practice into tattooing over the last 4 or 5 years, and seeing that change and evolve with your fine arts and your tattooing specifically. But something I've always really enjoyed about your painting and your fine arts and your ink work is like the immense detail within the simplicity of it. So I guess my question is, have you ever found tattooing to be like a little bit limiting in terms of like tattooing as a medium and what you can kind of do with it?
That is a really good question, and thank you for asking. When I started tattooing, I was feeling limited already. So the tattooing like expanded my world in quite a bit, as you know, because you're a tattoo artist. So you know that it's like this great responsibility and there's so much to it. It's a huge learning curve. It's not like, you know, painting on a flat surface. But that said, to me, it's still quite exciting and I'm not quite limited yet. Sometimes I feel like I want to explore within what I know. And an example would be, in the last 2 years, I switched my mark making and tattooing to just dot work. So for those who are familiar with like tattoo mark making that I do, or like even just tattooing, there's different ways that you can use your needle on your machine. And for me, I didn't want to be pulling lines anymore. And so I wanted to switch to dot work because it was an act of self-care. So I found that pulling lines was like hard on my body. And I wanted to do something that was like beneficial for me for the longevity of like tattooing. And dot work was more gentle, and it was gentle on the client, and it healed better in the way that I was doing. And it like was more in line with how I wanted to make the work look. So when I switched into that, I was like really reinvigorated again, and I was excited about what those possibilities were. So when I get bored of dot work, then maybe I will explore something different. I know I've started doing a tiny bit of color, so we'll see. But thanks for your question.
Hello. So I go to AU Arts and I'm writing a guide for your work downstairs, Regrounded, and I'm wondering if there's any significance to the skeleton that is visible in the Aswang and the mushrooms that are in that work.
Yeah, I mean, nothing like too specific, in that when I did the red skeleton, which you probably will see in that painting downstairs, I just wanted to talk about the transparency of the body. And when you look at the skeleton, it's not really inside her, it's kind of on top of her. So yeah, I just kind of was playing with this idea of surface and the idea of decomposition, and fungi are like sort of one of the first organisms that like enact this kind of decomposition and regeneration. So both of those elements really just emphasize that. Thanks.
Haema, I'm going to ask you for closing comments, and then thank you.
No, oh no, I don't. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much to Marigold for taking me through this journey as well, because I've really enjoyed the conversations that we've had and the studio visits and all the, you know, the images, and it's been so wonderful to get to know your practice in this quite deep way, I think. And thank you so much for the conversation this evening and taking us through your work with so much thoughtfulness, and to everyone out there for these great questions, and for being very much a part of this conversation as well. So yeah, thank you to everyone. Thank you to Marigold, thank you to Contemporary Calgary, and for being here tonight. And I think I'm leaving it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
you both very much. That was a thoroughly invigorating conversation. I'm sure we could have all stayed for a lot longer. And perhaps this is an opportunity to plan part 2. But thank you both. Thank you, Haema, and thank you, Marigold. And thank you, everyone, for your questions and for being a wonderful audience. The exhibition Human Capital is up till April 16th. And the show at SAG is up till sometime in April. Go soon. And thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.